the preconceived or the assumed worldview of the investigator will have a tremendous effect in constraining the range of hypotheses they're willing to consider. So one of the things that we've been challenging in the ID movement is not just the scientific arguments for chemical or biological evolution or theories thereof, but we've been challenging a principle of method known as methodological naturalism or methodological materialism that says if you're going to be a good scientist, you must limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations for everything. Well, we think that that's a reality-limiting assumption, or it limits our ability to possibly to know reality as it is. If you're in the social sciences, it may well be that there is something like a mind or a soul that gives people powers of agency and choice that are not determined by underlying laws of physics and chemistry, and therefore nature and nurture is not the only way to look at a human being. There may be a third option, a third hypothesis that explains behavior that is not materialistic. In the same way, if we're looking at the origin of life and we find that at the foundation of life there's digital code, it may not be the most rational or most scientific explanation. It may not be the best explanation to say it developed by undirected material processes of chemical reactions or chemical interactions. We know from experience that code and information comes from a mind. If we walked into the British Museum and looked at the Rosetta Stone, we wouldn't want to say that wind and erosion did that. We would want to say that a mind played a role in the creation of that information. So what we're doing is we're challenging the way in which some of these secular and materialistic assumptions, worldview assumptions, are limiting the intellectual freedom of scientists to follow the evidence where it most naturally leads. And so I think that speaks to your point. I would also say these young scientists that we're working with know full well that there are huge ideological pressures within scientific laboratories, scientific classrooms, scientific departments, and there's, by and large, the default worldview of many scientists is a kind of secular materialism or atheism, and young scientists who have a different worldview are very aware that they've got to play their cards close to the vest because those ideological pressures are very real, and they affect the perspective and the theories that come out of the scientific community.
No question about it. In fact, you've been called a pseudoscientist. I mean, you're obviously a brilliant writer.
Hank, the thing is, on Wikipedia, they used to say I was a theologian, which was their way of stigmatizing me. And we tried to edit that because, friends of the ID movement told me that they would get in and try to edit those entries because I have no degrees in theology, physics, earth science, philosophy of science, but none in theology. So eventually Wikipedia did change that, I think, and now the latest is that I'm a proponent of the pseudo-scientific theory of intelligent design. It's interesting, though, that one of the co-founders of Wikipedia has actually said publicly that Wikipedia's portrayal of intelligent design is deeply and unconscionably prejudicial. And he's been critical, even though he's not a proponent of ID, he said as an encyclopedia, they ought to do much better in the objectivity department.
And you're dealing with this with a great deal of humor. I mean, I think that's what you have to do.
Well, I've been telling our friend Günter Beckley, the German paleontologist, in fact, I like to introduce him now as the guy who got erased from Wikipedia. That's because he's that dangerous. This is a badge of honor. Far more people know about him now that he's been erased because there was quite a controversy about whether Wikipedia should have done this. And it just spotlighted the fact that we have a leading European paleontologist who has become a proponent of intelligent design, and he did so initially from a non-religious viewpoint. He was initially a scientific materialist himself.
I want to talk a little bit about your New York Times bestseller, Darwin's Doubt. Darwin's Doubt, I think, revolves around the Cambrian explosion or the Cambrian radiation. I mean, this was something that absolutely upset his awful cart.
Well, right. I mean, Darwin was for all of his rhetorical excesses, and there were some, especially as we see more and more about the way the science works in retrospect. But I think he was rhetorically modest in most of his work. And that is to say, he was willing to acknowledge things that were puzzles and things that his theory didn't explain. And one of the big classes of evidence that he recognized did not fit with his theory was the discontinuities in the fossil record, which didn't fit with his branching tree, gradual picture of the development of life over time. And one of the biggest discontinuities was the event that we now call the Cambrian explosion. Darwin was very much aware of it. He wrote about it, and he said it was inexplicable at the time. He didn't have, it would have to await further discovery. He thought that the fossil record would eventually get filled in and maybe solve the problem, but it hasn't. The problem of discontinuity has grown more pronounced, and so it was a big problem in his day, but it's become a more, and this was the argument I made in the book. In a sense, I told the story of the mystery of the Cambrian explosion and showed how the mysteries become more acute for two reasons. One, because the missing ancestral fossils of these Cambrian animals that appear very abruptly in the fossil record, those missing ancestral fossils have not been found. But secondly, the abrupt appearance of all this biological form in the fossil record, and it's not just a Cambrian phenomenon. It occurs up and down the rock column where you get brand new forms of life emerging abruptly. It raises essentially an engineering question. How would the evolutionary process build all those new forms of life? And that problem's become more acute as well because of what we've learned about the importance of information to life. The information stored in DNA and other places in living cells is absolutely necessary for building animal form. So when we see new forms of life arising in the Cambrian explosion and other times in the history of life, we're not just witnessing explosions of biological form, we're witnessing explosions of information. And the Darwinian mechanism doesn't explain that very well at all, and yet we also know that information invariably in our experience comes from a mind or an intelligence. So I think we're looking at a very powerful evidence for intelligent design as we look at these abrupt appearances throughout the history of life.
I think it's fair to say that the Cambrian explosion is biology's version of the Big Bang. So just as cosmology's Big Bang undid the dogma of an eternal universe, you have biology's Big Bang uprooting Darwin's tree of life.
Absolutely. And in fact, many paleontologists have referred to the Cambrian explosion as biology's Big Bang. And there was even a cover story on Time magazine in the late 90s after the discovery of the Chinese Cambrian find near the Chinese city of Chengjiang. And it was called Evolution's Big Bang. But one of the paleontologists who was quoted in the article said, how much faster does this event have to get before we stop calling this evolution? So it's very abrupt, geologically and biologically speaking.
Signature in the Cell, your book, is the first book to make a comprehensive case for the ID principle based on DNA. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was a book a long time in coming for me, embarrassingly long with respect to my colleagues. I had a teaching position with a heavy teaching load when I first got out of grad school. In a few years after that, John West, my colleague at Discovery, and I founded the Center for Science and Culture. Eventually, that caused me to leave the teaching, but then I had administrative responsibilities. But all the while, I was working on this argument that I had begun to think about in grad school. It's the argument from DNA, the extraordinary discovery of the 20th century, and maybe in the history of science, is the discovery that at the foundation of life is digital information stored in the double helix molecule DNA. And I had been thinking about the implications of that for a very long time. One of the really exciting parts of that whole molecular biological revolution, post-Watson and Crick, they make the discovery of the structure of DNA in 1953. In 1958, which happens to be the year I was born, Crick put forward something called the sequence hypothesis, where he realized that the DNA was storing information in a digital or alphabetic form, that the chemical subunits of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And within very few years, that was confirmed. And then as people began to think about that, they realized this is a big problem for both biological and chemical evolutionary theory, because if you think about random mutations, for example, you start changing a section of highly specific code where the arrangement of the characters is necessary to the function that it performs, whether it's in a computer domain or in an English text or in the DNA context. You change specifically arranged informational characters, you're going to degrade that information long before you're ever going to come to something fundamentally new and informational. No computer programmer wants random changes introduced into some functional code. It's going to destroy the code as the changes accumulate. So I just began to think about, well, if the undirected materialistic processes can't explain the origin of information, what does? And a lot of my work in my PhD in Cambridge was on the methods of reasoning in the historical sciences. And Darwin himself had a key criterion of a good historical explanation, and that was that it posits a cause which is known to produce the effects in question. He called that the vera causa principle. As I began to think about that, I realized there was only one cause of which we knew that explained this key effect in question, that key effect being information, and the cause being intelligence. One of the leading information theorists said early on, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Well, if that's something we know, then what can we infer about the information present in the DNA molecule? It must have also arisen from conscious, rational activity, from intelligent design, and I developed that argument in the book. First, in Signature in the Cell, as I looked at the question of the origin, the ultimate origin of biological information with the first life. Many of my colleagues and I attended the Royal Society meeting in November of 2016. We write a bit about it in the Theistic Evolution book, and pointed out that the meeting was called by leading evolutionary theorists who wanted to evaluate the current status of neo-Darwinism in a critical and skeptical way, because most of them who called the meeting were critical and skeptical, and secondly, to explore what other evolutionary mechanisms might be in play that could either replace or supplement the inadequate mechanism of mutation and selection. At the beginning of the conference, the first talk was by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, Gerd Müller, who outlined the explanatory deficits of the neo-Darwinian mechanism and neo-Darwinian theory. His talk could have been taken right out of Darwin's Doubt. He talked about the problem of phenotypic, that is body-level, visible complexity in organisms. He talked about the problem of anatomical novelty. Where do you get all these new complex structures? And he talked about the abrupt appearance of fossil forms in the geological record. None of these problems, he thought, had been solved. The problem of the origin of biological form, he lists with a co-author in another book, as an unsolved problem. At the end of the conference, as they explored these different other possible evolutionary mechanisms, one of the people who was a prime mover in a group called the Altenberg 16, which are evolutionary biologists critical of neo-Darwinism, and who was involved in putting together the conference, said that unfortunately the conference was characterized by a lack of momentousness. This is Susan Mazur. And so, in other words, the conference defined the problems with neo-Darwinism effectively at the beginning, but at the end, even the proponents had to realize that they hadn't solved those problems.